Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail. Today we are going to share werewolf horror stories. First story. The time I saw a werewolf. I've been debating whether I should be posting this particular event or not. The subject matter is a hard one to digest. However, these past few days, this particular event keeps surfacing in my mind, and I just have to write it down. Yet my stomach is swirling with the thought of reliving this. Since I could remember, I've always been a magnet to anything supernatural, ghost, or demons, you name it, and it will find me. This event occurred when I was 7 or 6 years old. My baby sisters, who was 2 years of age at the time, is asleep on my mother bed. My parents just got divorced, my dad taking all the money and moved in with other women and her children. This left my mom with no money and 2 young girls. So, we moved into a tiny house with neighbor right on your doorstep. It's winter, so all windows and doors are shut tight, and the doors are locked as my mom is afraid of any break-ins. I sat on my room's floor playing with my dolls, while my mom is washing dishes in the kitchen. The layout of the house is very simple, which means that the kitchen, bathroom, and my room shares the same wall. And that means that all the windows on that side of the house shares the same view of the garden. I remember the thick, dark brown curtains that used to hang over the windows in my bedroom. I've never been afraid of the dark, nor anything that may be lingering in it, so when I heard a knock on my window, I didn't hesitate to look. At the time, my mother was big in scaring me by jumping from around corners and out of closets, so I just expected it to be her behind the curtains. Instead, I saw a large face peering at me from outside. His hands are cupped around his face. At first, I couldn't understand what I was witnessing, but before I realized it, he had disappeared, leaving behind a fogged-up window with the imprint of his ugly face. I so wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The shock of what just happened froze me to my place, and only the shrill scream of my mother brought me back. I followed her voice into her bedroom, where she stood over my sister's sleeping form. Being only a 2 years old enabled her to sleep through anything. My mom, visible shock as she held on to me, asking what I saw at the window. I simply replied, a werewolf. He had fur sticking out of his skin, claws on his fingers which tapped at my window, a large dog-like tongue that had stuck out of his large pointy mouth, and yet he had a human body. It was my mom's turn to freeze, her breathing picking up, her hands starting to sweat on my shoulder. I saw the same thing. She whispered softly. He ran past the kitchen window on all fours towards your bedroom. The following night, my mom awoke screaming and thrashing around on her bed, repeating that the werewolf was chalking her while she was sleeping. Black and purple bruises formed thickly around her neck. Now I bring this up, especially here, because I had asked my mom of this event years later, wondering if she remembers what had happened, desperately hoping that I was in fact making it all up. She nodded, saying it still vividly and repeatedly plays over in her mind, her hand absent-mindedly rubbing her now healed neck. I asked what she had thought they wanted from us. Her face paled as she said, "They were trying to kill me, to get to you." My heart stopped. See, that night wasn't the only time I saw that thing. I have recently moved in with my boyfriend. We live in an apartment building on the 4th floor, and I swear I saw it by my bedroom window. Second story. The wolf. The wolf will come for me. The wolf came for my father. The wolf came for my grandfather. The wolf came for his father and his father. The wolf will come for me. My father tried to keep the wolf away from me. As soon as he learned that my mother was pregnant, he sold everything he owned, including his treasured car, and hauled us across the country to North Wales. I was born at home, in the small country cottage which my father had bought using everything he'd raised. Father wouldn't allow a doctor or midwife to be present. My mother passed not long afterwards. Leukemia. I always believed Father resented me for our having to leave, for the loss of his possessions, and for the loss of Mother. Now I know he resented me for a very different reason. Father never let me outside without supervision. My earliest memories were of stuffy rooms, yellow walls, and the never-ending smell of tobacco. I didn't attend school. Father taught me everything I needed to know about being alive. Cooking, cleaning, fire-making, and growing vegetables in our garden. Father was a strict vegetarian. Never any meat allowed in the house, raw or cooked. This included pet food, so dogs and cats were out of the question. I asked Father once about getting a rabbit or some hamsters. I'd knocked on the door of his office and waited for him to answer. When he emerged, his torn and stained shirt barely concealing his scarred torso, I posed the question as sweetly as I could. He hacked a huge gobbet of phlegm into his mouth, swallowed, and looked at me. "And how do you plan to take care of it, boy?" he asked. Father never used my name, except for matters of discipline. "It's weak and defenseless. Will you protect it when predators come, blood and foam dripping from their gaping maws? Will you stand forward as their claws rake at flesh?" I stammered. "I thought not, boy." "Now, where did you get the idea for such things?" "In the book, sir. All about animals." "In the library?" He grunted and slammed the door. That night, when he stoked the fire to warm us as we ate, I saw the cover of the book as it was devoured by the flames. Father saw me looking and fixed me with his good eye. "You're better rid of such fancies, boy." Those were the only words he spoke that evening. I always found Father's single eye frightening. Its missing counterpart seemed to lend the remaining globe an air of madness. I darted around the room constantly, always watching Father's peripherals. He never focused on one thing for long. One of my first lessons was not to ask Father about his missing eye, or any of the scars which patchworked his body. He'd taught me that with my full name, and with his belt. Whenever we weren't doing garden work, Father would remain locked in his office. I later learned that he had good reason. I would spend time running about the house, testing my time by the grandfather clock which sat in the small living room cum dining area. Sometimes I would race against the only friends I had, those I had found in the few books which Father didn't burn. I was faster than Bilbo Baggins and the twisted Long John Silver, but was often left in the dust by Captain Ahab. Father would come down at tea time and eat whatever I had made. Then he would sit by the fire and watch the flames until morning. I never saw him sleep. On my 6th birthday, Father took me outside to the garden and threw the wood axe at my feet. "Pick it up, boy." I dutifully obliged and began making my way to the woodpile. "Where are you going?" "To cut the wood, sir." "We're not cutting wood, boy." I returned to him. "What are we doing then, sir?" His fist was like lightning, landing on my cheek like a blacksmith's hammer. I don't even remember hitting the floor. I woke up a few seconds later, pain screaming across my face. I tried to speak, but my jaw refused to move. Father spoke. "If you can't defend yourself, then you'll be swallowed. Swing the axe, boy. Keep me away." I swung the axe. Father stepped around it and fetched me another blow, less forceful this time and with an open palm, across the side of my head. My head rang like 1,000 bells. The afternoon passed like this. My paltry attempts to swing the axe met with Father's derision and pain. When my arms could no longer heft the heavy weapon, Father took it from me. "Getting close to tea," was all he said. And that was how our days continued. Wake before the rising of the sun, chores, gardening with Father, lunchtime, in which I could steal a few minutes of reading, practice with the axe, make tea, and then to bed. Every day the same. The morning of my 16th birthday was different. Bleary-eyed, I made my way down the cold-wood stairs. Through the window, I noticed Father in the garden. He was seated on a homemade chair, axe across his lap, staring out towards the horizon. The dying embers of a fire smoked beside him. I walked out into the crisp air, breath fogging before me. "Father." He didn't turn his head. "Boy, would you like breakfast?" "Not today, boy." He puffed on his cigarette and threw the butt into the fire. He reached into the pocket of his threadbare corduroys, pulled out another, and lit it. "What are you doing out here, Father?" I said, and took a step back. He didn't reach for his belt. Instead, a single hand extended outwards and beckoned me forward. I stepped up beside him. He indicated out over the windswept hills. "Something's coming, boy. From out there. I have to be ready." "What is it, Father?" He grunted. "You'll see, boy. Wait here with me." He reached out and grabbed me by the front of the shirt. "But when I tell you, you go inside, and you bolt the door. Do you hear me?" "Yes, sir." He rounded his eye on me. Despite the empty bottle of Jack Daniels which leaned against his foot, he was remarkably focused. "Do you hear me, boy?" "Yes, sir. I do, sir." "Imachim, grab that stump and sit with me." He released his grip. I did as ordered. Nothing happened. After what must have been several minutes, and at least 3 cigarettes, Father coughed loudly and reached down. He produced another bottle of Jack and pulled the top off. He handed it to me. I took it. He looked at me again and nodded. I put the bottle to my lips and took an ambitious swig. It burned. I coughed, retched, and leaned forward. The burn on the way up was worse than on the way down. Father laughed. "You'll get used to it, boy. You won't have a choice. Try again." I sat myself up, resolved not to look weak in front of Father again. I swallowed another mouthful. I retched again, but this time it stayed down. Father snorted. "Getting there already." We sat in silence while the sun rose across the blue-gray sky. A shape caught my eye. It was black and moved fast, standing out against the green of the grass-covered hills. "Father." "I see it, boy." His knuckles had tightened around the axe. "When it reaches those stones there, I want you to go inside. Understand me?" "Yes, Father." "Good." He took the bottle from me and drank deeply. "What is it, Father?" "Don't ask questions, boy. You don't need to know." "But Father Dash." He silenced me with a vicious glance of that single, manic eye. Then he sighed. He handed the bottle back to me and rose from his seat. "You remember what I told you about my father, boy?" "Yes, sir. He died when you were still young. He died on my 16th birthday, boy. I didn't listen to him. That's how I lost this." He turned, knelt in front of me, and indicated his missing eye. "It wasn't an accident that took him, boy. It was that. That out there took your grandfather, took his father, and took all the men in our family as far back as any of us have ever known." He paused and looked away at that black shape, drawing ever nearer. "I've been hard on you, boy. I know it. But you need to understand that I had good reason. You need to understand that after today this might be your responsibility."
I'm sorry.
"Now go inside, boy. Go to my office and lock the door. Don't open it until I do." I felt something heavy inside of me. Father Dash. He shoved me hard, and I hit the ground. "You gave me your word, boy. Don't make yourself a liar." I stared at him in silence. He stood and turned towards the black shape, hefting his axe in his hand. I scrabbled to my feet. As I approached the door, the sound of my feet hitting the floor was accompanied by a growl. The deep, low sound was all malice and hatred. I was filled with ice, reaching from the base of my spine to the tips of my fingers. I glanced backwards. The shape was bounding over the last crest, all matted fur and gnashing teeth. A pair of eyes, black pits full of the same mania I could see in Father's eyes, caught the sun as they turned on me. They spurred my steps, and I hammered into the door. It gave way, and I staggered wildly to keep my feet. Pain sparked in my shoulder. The growling exploded into a long howl, followed by a series of barks. Father screamed 1,000 curses, words I'd never heard before, and though I didn't understand them, their meaning was not lost. I reached his office and slammed the door, bolting it shut. Both Father and the beast fell silent. I pressed my ear against the heavy wood of the door. I heard a snarl, though from Father or the beast I did not know, and then a yelp. I realized that I had held the breath in my lungs and let it out in a soft exhale. Father had one. I looked around the room and my breath caught in my throat. Pinned to every wall in the dingy room were drawings. Hundreds and hundreds of charcoal drawings, all depicting the same thing. A black shape, slavering jaws, evil eyes. Notebooks lay open upon the desk. Scrawlings across every page detailed times and dates. I picked up the first one. November 22nd, 1745, Master William, 36. August 3rd, 1780, Master Edgar, 35. The wolf came. The wolf always comes. The wolf always comes. The wolf always comes. There was a scream, which raced through my soul. I knew my father's voice, though it was rent out of shape, like the bonnet of a car after a head-on collision. I threw up again. The scream, cold and agonized, cut off suddenly. I pulled away from the door, dragging myself across the bare wood with numb hands. I curled up into the fetal position and wept until I was dry. I don't know how long passed, but by the time I found the strength to stand, the sun was rising again. The next day, I felt as though I had a rope taut around my stomach and my lungs had deflated. My throat burned from the vomit. I went back down the stairs and, holding my breath, pressed my face to the window. The burned-out fire pit, paw prints in the mud, whiskey bottles, and Father's chair in splinters. No other sign of the fight which had taken Father from me. I moved into the garden. The air stabbed the inside of my lungs. I spread my gaze out, frost clinging to the grass. My father's axe lay in the grass, tooth marks drilled deep into the woods. It's the only thing of his I still own. I was taken into care, and my father's estate waited for me until I turned 18. I sold everything as soon as I could. Everything I couldn't sell went a landfill. I moved to Cardiff and rented a flat. I got a job. There was a woman there. I fell for her. She fell for me. Then she got pregnant, and my eyes went manic. My son turns 16 in 1 week. He doesn't know about the wolf, and as I bring Father's axe out from storage, I swear to myself he'll never need to. The wolf will come for me. Third story. Henry cried wolf. When the sheriff asked me what happened to my cousin Henry, I lied. I kept that lie up even when I had to look my parents and his mother in the eyes. It wasn't that hard. Every survival instinct I had told me that my life was on the line. Nobody would have believed the truth, and I didn't want to wind up in a straitjacket and a padded room. I feel safe telling this story on an anonymous forum, but only because the present day and the events of that night are separated by many years. My cousin Henry was not a well-adjusted kid. Today he'd be diagnosed with one or more disorders, but back in the 70s adults thought he was just a brat, and the other kids thought he was weird. Henry's father died in the war just 5 days before he was born, so a suffering and traumatized Aunt Lily treated him like he was a god kinglet and just couldn't see anything wrong with him no matter what he did. By the time he was 10, his teacher was openly hostile and wanted him out of her classroom. He had no friends and spent way too much time on punishment detail in the principal's office. The final straw came when his alligator mouth brought him into conflict with a mean 8th grader, and he ended up in the emergency room with a chipped tooth and stitches. Aunt Lily decided that Chicago was just too mean a place for her precious and fled back to the small rural area my family lives in. She figured that he'd be protected by our family's prominent position in the county. She moved in with my grandparents who lived in a cottage on my parents' property. Mom was hopeful that with patience and firmness, the family could teach her sister's child to at least fake acting normal by the time school started. But she was scared too, because introducing him to the neighbor kids had been a complete disaster. Even the nice, quiet ones didn't want to play with him after one visit. So that's why on that Saturday night in August, it was just Henry and me at home while my parents, Lily, and my grandparents were at the movies. None of the other cousins wanted to come over because, well, Henry. I really didn't mind it though. By the end of summer, when he and I were alone, the boy was mostly okay for hours at a time. I was 17, practically grown in his eyes, and he realized that unlike Grandma, my mom and his, I walked away when he started kicking, spitting, or throwing himself on the floor. I'd also twice saved him from getting smacked upside the head by the neighbor kids. He'd gotten to the point where he'd actually knock on my door and ask if he could come in and play on his G.I. Joes while I read. Sometimes he'd ask questions about our family or his father, but usually he was content to lie on the floor by my bed, and we were just quiet together. That night he didn't stay in my room for long and wanted to run around in the backyard. The boy had a lot of nervous energy and needed to burn it off. I thought nothing of it. For a kid who had been raised in a city apartment, our 50-acre wooded property must have been a wild kingdom. Everything was beautifully normal until I heard him screaming all the way upstairs to my room. "Cece," he cried for me. "There's a wolf out here." That was ridiculous. There hasn't been a wolf in this county in 100 years. I figured he saw a deer from a distance, or maybe an actual unfriendly stray dog. Still, I heard the panic in his voice, and I rushed down to the kitchen door that led to the yard to go get him. It was dark, of course, and the porch light was burned out, but I could see Henry standing there in the backyard, jumping up and down and grinning like he'd won a prize. "You're so dumb."
Fulya.
I called him a name that shames me too much to repeat even now and went back inside, locking the kitchen door behind me. About 20 minutes later, he was banging on it. I ignored him. He threw gravel at the front door. That just pissed me off, and I made him wait some more. The only reason I eventually went downstairs to let him in because it was getting close to 11 p.m., and I didn't want him outside carrying on when my folks came back. "Come on in, Henry," I called. He was sitting in one of the yard chairs at the far end of the yard and didn't answer. I heard something rustling in the bushes. I tried again. "The monster movie is going to come on soon. I'll order pizza, and we can watch it together if you come in right now." The promise of pizza got him up. He started back as slowly as he could, though, and I didn't wait for him. That's when he let out a loud shriek. I sighed. It was going to be a long night. "Cece, there is a wolf out here. I mean this time." He was back to that crap again. I was about to yell at him, but instead of coming in, he just banged on the glass door. I turned and meant to drag him in when I saw a dark hulk of a shape right behind him. Henry was trying to open the door, but the shape was more clear and I could see that it was a wolf. It was impossible. I knew that in my mind, but I was seeing it. This wolfish thing was taller than a tall man and stood upright. I saw the pointed ears, the shaggy dark hair, and white, shiny fangs bigger than any dog I'd ever seen. Its eyes were brown and yellow and more human in expression than of that of an animal's. The beast stared at me and seemed calm and fully in control of itself and the situation as I stood there frozen in the kitchen. One massive hand, or paw I guess, pressed against the door so Henry couldn't open it, and the other clamped around his neck. It cocked its huge head and winked at me. and then it leapt away, taking Henry with it. My cousin had never stopped screaming the whole time, but now there was silence. Absolute silence. No owls or crickets made a sound. It was as if sane and normal nature was appalled at what we'd just seen. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my own ears. I went straight upstairs to my parents' room and lay down on their bed. That's where they found me, wrapped in their bedspread when they came home. The town went crazy. I told the sheriff that Henry had a tantrum and went outside. I decided to let him cool off and fell asleep in my parents' room. If the sheriff had any doubts in my story, that night they vanished when searchers found some of Henry 2 days later in the woods. I vomited all over the dining room floor after I overheard my grandfather tell my dad that it was about enough to fill a small duffel bag. The public statement was that Henry was attacked by an animal. The paw prints were too big to be a dog's and were the wrong shape for a bear, so our 3-man police force put it down to coyotes. They were not stupid men, so I'm guessing that they knew what got Henry and decided that they weren't going down the supernatural road on an official report. Aunt Lily was sick with grief for a long time, but she found comfort in the friendship of Devlin Cooper. Dev was a game warden. He was one of the searchers who'd found Henry's remains and had spent weeks tracking and killing the coyotes that were thought to be responsible. He'd known our family for years and had been a friend to Aunt Lily's deceased husband. Everyone was happy when he, one of the nicest guys in town, convinced her to marry him. At the reception, I whispered to him, "Thanks for making Lily so happy. That's all I've wanted to do since the first time I saw her when we were kids," he replied. Then he leaned close to me and said very quietly, "But I knew I had no chance with the female as long the cub was around. You're a good kid, Cecilia. Stay that way." He straightened up, looked at me with those uncommonly beautiful brown and yellow eyes, and winked. Fourth story. The Wolf at the Door. The door opened to a smiling, middle-aged woman who introduced herself as Sandra from the email. Stepping back to let me in, she told me that it was nice to finally meet me. Asked how my trip up had been. Were there any problems finding the house? I murmured something polite and non-committal as I stepped inside and looked around with a hammering heart. The house was isolated, but both outside and inside it seemed perfectly mundane. Pleasant even. The same could be said for Sandra. She'd been nice during our brief email conversation, and she was the same in person. Laid back, friendly, and slightly self-effacing as she led me into the living room and offered me a snack or drink. There was that unspoken thing hanging in the air between us, of course. The only reason I was there was because she'd called in a favor with Dr. Perkins, her old friend and my faculty advisor. I was told without it being said explicitly that helping him out with this favor, that he didn't want to undertake himself for some reason, would lead to my barely passing GPA becoming a safely passing one. The other, less savory, implication was that refusing to come up here might tip things the other way. Still, I had no way of knowing if Sandra knew any of this. More than likely, she'd asked Perkins for help, and he'd foisted it off on a grad student without her input or consent. More than likely, she was just as uncomfortable as I was, even if she was a bit less in the dark.
So, Sandra.
I know we talked about me coming up here and documenting something, talking to you and recording anything noteworthy that happened while I'm up here, but I don't know what that means. I gave her an awkward smile that she returned. I mean, I'm glad to try and help, but I'm an anthropology student, not a doctor or something more psychological, or, I blushed. I'm not trying to say you're crazy or something, God. I just... Sandra laughed and raised her hand. Take a breath, honey. It's okay. You're not going to offend me. And I know you got roped into this by Jasper because he didn't want to take the time to come up here. I get that. I haven't seen the man in 20 years, so it's understandable. And regardless of what you do or don't do, Even if you walk out in 5 minutes, I'll give you a glowing report, rest assured. She paused and watched me for a second. Deal? I swallowed and nodded gratefully. Yeah, I appreciate it, but I'm happy to stay and help, if I can. I went to grab my tablet to start taking notes when I realized I hadn't brought it in. Shoot, I need to go get my stuff in so I can write stuff down. I started to get up, but she was already waving me back to my seat. Don't worry about that yet. Let's just talk a bit, get you better acclimated to what's going on, and then we can go from there. Sound good? Settling back into my chair, I nodded.
Yeah, Sure.
I glanced around the living room. It was strange. I liked the room a lot. It had a cozy, comfortable look to it that you remember from my email that I said I wanted you to help me document a phenomena that has been occurring for a number of years, right? Sandra chuckled. I guess that made it sound to you like I thought my house was haunted or something. I gave her a nervous grin. Yeah, kinda. Not wanting to offend her, I went on. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm not here to pass judgment on your beliefs or whatever. She gave a short, laughing snort and shook her head. Jesus, Kiji. Really, it's okay. And no, it's not ghosts or something. Well, it is something, but not ghosts. Her expression darkened slightly. I don't know what to call it really, even after all this time. But the easiest way for me to explain what's happening is by telling you what has happened. Sandra gave me a small smile. With your permission, of course. I nodded, and she began. When I was younger, not much older than you. In fact, I worked as a caretaker for a man in my hometown. He was old and set for money, if not quite rich, and he paid and treated me well enough. Most days I would spend 4 hours with him, though occasionally it would be more if his nurses needed a break. At first we didn't talk much at all. He spent most of his time reading or watching TV, and I busied myself with cleaning and laundry or occasionally getting him things he wanted from town. Still, over the 4 years I worked for him, we became friends. He really was a nice man. His liver was failing him, but his mind was still sharp and he was very funny. Had a really dry, sarcastic sense of humor that I think a lot of people took as him being an asshole. But no, he was a good man overall. As I grew to care for him, care about him, it made me sad that he was so alone. Sure, he had me in the rotation of nurses, but no friends ever came to visit. No family ever called or came by. One of the day nurses, I called her Lottie, she said he had family up north, but they hadn't come to see him in the 5 years she'd been knowing him. I was the only one there when he died, and sadly, I was just about the only one that went to his funeral. All those men and women I'd seen come and go over the years, even Lottie that had known him the longest of them all, couldn't be bothered to stop by and pay their respects. It made me angry and sad and lonely in a way I can't quite describe. The service was short and perfunctory. The funeral home director said some generic platitudes, read a couple of Bible verses, and asked if anyone wished to say anything. I thought it was kind of a sick joke to even ask the question since I was the only there, but something in the way the man had looked over the room made me turn around in my chair. Sitting in the back row was an old man. But not just an old man. He looked like the same man we were burying that day. Neither of us went up to speak, and after a final moment of silence, the ceremony was done. I barely noticed. All I could think about was how was any of this possible? If it was some trick, or if I was in a dream. But no. Logically, I knew the man was dead. I had been there when he died. After all, so that meant this man must be a relative, maybe even a twin brother. I turned back, half expecting the man to be gone, but he was still sitting there on the back row, meeting my gaze calmly and giving me a slight nod. Taking it as an invitation, I stood up and went back to sit next to him. Hello there. Are you his brother? You look just like him. The man watched me for several seconds before pulling out a small envelope from his coat pocket. You should read this. It'll explain things better than I could. I'm assuming you can recognize his handwriting? I nodded as I took the envelope. Yeah, I think so. I glanced up at him. So you want me to read this here, or? He chuckled. No time like the present. I didn't like him watching me the way he was, or sitting this close to him. He was like the man I'd known, but different. Up close I could feel the subtleties of that, and him looking so much like the person I'd known and cared for made the dissonance that much harder to bear. But I didn't want to be rude by moving away, and I also didn't want to wait to read what my friend had written to me. So doing my best to ignore him, I opened the envelope. I realized that Sandra was holding out a small envelope to me now, yellowed with age and well-worn with use. I knew what it was even before she asked me to read it. The letter inside was smeared in places by some old stain, but otherwise was perfectly legible, each word written in trembling but well-formed letters that leaned forward as though rushing to get to the end of it all. This is what it said. I'm writing you this because I'm a coward. I should have had the decency to tell you this in person before I passed, but I wanted to spare myself that pain. I also didn't want to risk you leaving before it was all done. The person that gave you this letter, well, it's not a person at all. I don't know what it is, honestly, as we don't really talk frequently despite our constant companionship, and to the extent that we do, it has never given me a clear answer on its nature or origin. I know how it came to me, of course. I worked for a man in my 30s that passed it to me before hanging himself in his office one night. No doubt you think I'm crazy at this point, or this is some kind of macabre posthumous practical joke. Neither is true, though time and your own experience will convince you of that far better than I ever could. The point for now isn't to make you believe, but just to have you understand, to give you some reference point for how your life has just changed in the hopes that it makes the transition easier and less painful. I don't know what it is, but I know what it does. It haunts you, not like a ghost, you understand. And while it can look like a variety of people when it wants, other people can't see it or hear it. Only the person it imprints on even knows it's there. Imprints on. I just realized that's how I've thought about it for years. Like it's a baby duck or something. So absurd, but no less accurate in its absurdity. And don't mistake me, it's not actively malign as far as I can tell. Not actively. It isn't a ghost, and though I know only a little about such things, I don't think it's a demon either, if demons exist. It doesn't ever possess you. Not exactly. As far as I can tell, it just stays with you in one of two states, separate or joined. Separate is how it always begins, I think. It just stays around, in the corner of your view, rarely talking aside from when you catch its eye. When you do, most of the time it says the same phrase. I accept you. This is, of course, terrifying and confusing at first, especially when you have no warning or explanation of what's going on. My predecessor didn't even leave a suicide note, much less any instructions for how I should deal with my new burden. I spent months thinking I was crazy or cursed, and there was more than once that I was close to killing myself as well. Pulling myself back from that edge took time, and a large part of that came from acceptance of my situation. I stopped telling people about it. It only drove them away. I stopped trying to find answers as to what it was, or why this was all happening to me. In truth, if I didn't have a means to stop it, would it any of that really matter anyway? I tried talking to it, but it would only rarely respond. In all honesty, it seemed as confused and unhappy as I was. I think when it's separate, it's lessened somehow. Its memory is strange and fluctuant. Its sense of place and purpose waste away. and I developed the sense that its attachment to me wasn't by choice, but something in its nature. It was as though we were two inmates, trapped in a cell made out of each other. So I decided to try the one thing I hadn't. The next time it said it accepted me, I responded in kind. In truth, very little changed. I could feel it in a way I couldn't before, but to my surprise I found its presence comforting. I could tell it felt the same. And since that day when I was 37, I've gone on to have a wife, a family, a fulfilling career, a very good life. You can too. That's the real point of all this. Don't feel like it's a punishment. If anything, it's a blessing. So many people feel alone, and you never will. It will never hurt you, and it can be a true friend in its own strange way. I'll leave you with this. Thank you for all you did for me, for your care and friendship. I'm sorry to burden you with this, but it has to go to someone, and I can't think of no one I trust more. While it is ultimately your decision, I ask you to trust me in this one. Last thing. When it says it accepts you, just accept it back, with love and respect. Jasper. I looked up with a frown. Jasper? Jasper like Dr. Perkins? Sandra smiled at me sadly. Yes, if you like. Honey, there is no Dr. Perkins. I mean, Jasper was a professor, but he's been dead for 20 years. I glanced back at the letter before putting it on the coffee table in front of me. I suddenly didn't want to touch it anymore. I don't understand. The other woman nodded. I know you don't, and that's my fault. I've let you stew in this confusion and pain for all these years, watched you get worse, watched you suffer. Not that I haven't had a hard time too. I have, Lord knows. But I've come to realize how right Jasper was. I'm ready to join with you now. I stood up, my throat suddenly tight as I tried to breathe. No, you're crazy, Sandra stood up. Sweetie, do you remember your life before coming here today? Do you even remember how you got here before knocking on the front door? I wanted to argue, to cite evidence of my memory, of my life, of who I was as a person, but everything was muddled and murky. Why couldn't I remember? All I could remember was being in school and Dr. Perkins. No, I remember Dr. Perkins sent me here. We talked through email, and then I talked to you through email. The woman sighed. I shouldn't have let this go on so long. Being separated all these years, I've seen you slip more and more into these periods of confusion. You were so close to Jasper for so long you almost always use him as the basis for some fake memory, some placeholder identity. Sandra began crying. I'm so sorry. I've watched you suffer and rot like this and I could have stopped it sooner. But no more. I accept you. You hear me? I accept you. I'd started backing away, but something in her tone stopped me. What she was saying was impossible, wasn't it? Sensing my uncertainty, Sandra took a step forward. I know this is a lot to take, a lot to believe, but either I'm crazy or I'm right? So just say the words with me. If it doesn't work, if you're not what I say you are, then you can just go afterward. But if I'm right, I'm trying to save you, honey. Trying to make up for all the years I've done you wrong. Her shining eyes locked onto mine as she said the phrase again. I accept you. I spoke in a gasp, like the last breath of a dying woman. I accept you. I didn't really feel any different after saying the words, so maybe. I let out a scream as something moved on my leg. It was my phone, vibrating over and over in my pocket. A lump of ice began to form in my stomach as I dug it out, its implications already beginning to pierce the fog that was slowly lifting in my brain. For missed messages. Dr. Perkins, Clara, your assistance today won't be necessary. Please cancel your plans to visit Sandra Newborn. You will still receive the extra credit as we discussed. Dr. Perkins, Clara, if you would, please confirm that you received my earlier message. I repeat, do not go up to that house. Thank you. Dr. Perkins, it's past time you were supposed to be there. If you are inside already, get out right now. Do not listen to that thing. It is very dangerous. It destroyed my father, and it's haunted me for 20 years. I was wrong to make a deal with it, but it's not too late. That woman, or whoever answers the door at that house, is not human. I am not joking or insane. Please get away and let me know you are safe. Dr. Perkins, I just felt it pass from me. I'm so sorry. I looked up, trembling, to see Sandra standing over me. A wide, toothy smile open like a wound above two glittering eyes. Backpedaling, I started trying to head for the door. I don't accept you. I don't. She cut in with a sing-song voice that sounded like 100 voices at once. Too late. With that, she began to unfurl her true face, and I began to scream. Fifth story. The wolves of these frozen woods. I can't stand it to be back here. This tiny, rural town I grew up in. It makes my skin crawl to see everything around me. I'm well into middle age now, but it's like this town has been frozen in time since the time I was a teenager. And the older I get, the more things that in childhood seemed warm seem to radiate a freezing cold. The more things seem to hide teeth and claws and menace. I'm standing in these woods, the ones across from the house I grew up in, and I fall back into memory so easily. Everything is frozen. Everything is the same, just a little more. It's like something's wrong with the daylight here. My brother James likes things from the woods. Animals. Birds especially. When we were children, we used to go out into these woods almost every afternoon, looking for them. Birds. We just watched them, and he was so amazed, so in awe of these creatures. He never even got too close. So gentle. He'd just look up at them, appreciate the fact that they were there. And then he met Billy and Michael, and Peter, and then he started shooting the birds. My mind goes back almost 30 years. I feel like I'm right there. Like I'm right there. These woods will do that to you. I think back to that night. The first night that James... I'm sitting at the family dinner table.
I'm 17.
I count the plates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Count the chairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Count the bodies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where's my brother? Where's James? My sister says he went out with his friends. To the woods, she thought. My mother says she doesn't like him out after dark. 13-year-old boys should be home eating their dinner and not out in the woods at night. The food's getting cold as the air outside the house. Still no James. It's getting late. It's getting later. No one's seen him. I breathe in and out and in and out and in. Hold my breath. Time crawls.
No James.
I walk to Peter's house. The wind is picking up. The night is black. No moon. No nothing. My sister thought he was with his friend Peter. In the woods, Peter said. We were running, laughing. We were in the woods and trying to catch rabbits. We were in the woods trying to shoot a deer. We were in the woods, but then we left the woods, he tells me. We parted ways and I went to baseball practice and Billy went to the store and Michael went home to his mother and I don't know where James is, says Peter. I don't know, but he's not in the woods. The sheriff is called. They're all looking. Mother is sobbing. Father is drinking. My brothers and sisters are in and out of the house looking. Help them, Father says. You're 17. You're a man. Almost. Look with them. Help them. But I'm stuck to the chair and I'm staring out at the trees. I'm looking out to the part of the wood I can see from our window, and I hope to God, I hope he is not in the woods, He knows these woods. He knows them. One day gone and I look out at the sun starting to bleed through the trees. No sleep. Eyes open. Mocking sun in the morning teased. One night gone. One night gone. One night gone and no sign of James. The things in the woods. My mind cycles through the things in the woods. It cycles through everything soft and sweet. Everything that eats plants. Everything harmless before I think of the wolves. Oh God, the wolves. I stand out at night yelling, staring at the woods, staring at the trees. Maybe if I squint my eyes, maybe if I look closer, I'll see him there, waiting. James, 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 I call. Every James, echoing out into the black night. Where has the moon gone? Dogs bark and wolves howl. No one stops my own howling. I yell until my throat is raw and red and slashed up inside, until I fall asleep in a bed of dying leaves that crackle as I shift in the night. 2 days gone, taunting sun following me all day. 2 days, 2 days, 2 days. You'll never see him again. Your brother's eaten up. Your brother's eaten up. The wolves will come for you as well when I set. They comb through the woods and I wait and wait. Nothing. It's been too long. He knows these woods. He knows them. The wolves know them too. Peter is helping us search. I ask him which way James was headed when he saw him last. Home, he says. He was headed home. Peter ducks behind a tree and starts crying. I know he's scared. I leave him there. I come back in 10 minutes and his eyes are dry, and he's ready to press onwards. But we see no sign of James. That taunting sun dies on the evening of the 3rd day, and the moon comes out. The moon we haven't seen for days. In the darkness, I can just make out a shadow coming toward the house. The outline of a person, walking strangely, limping, staggering. James? James, is that you?
No. No.
Not James. It's not James. It's a woman. The strange woman that lives in the decaying cabin on the other side of town. People come to her when they can't find things, rings or keys or books, and she closes her eyes and she draws a map, and the people always find their rings or keys or books. Sometimes people ask her what their futures will be, when they will die, and she says she doesn't know. She can't do that. She says all she can do is find things. Years ago, people say, she saw 3 drowned children. In her mind, drowned in cold, deep Echo Lake. All young, but she didn't know who. And she didn't know when. And she tried to warn the town. She tried to warn them all. But she didn't know who and she didn't know when, and no one listened. And they let their children play in the lake. And the children were fine. And then one night, Mae Jackson, the preacher's wife, dragged her 3 children down to the lake, said she had the voice of God in her ear, telling her to bring her children to him. The next morning they found them, all 3 of them, drowned in that cold, deep lake. But the strange woman that lives in the decaying cabin on the other side of town says all she can do is find things. She staggers up to our doorstep and hands me crudely scrawled a map. The woods. And an X, deep in the heart of the woods. She walks away toward that moon as it crawls up the night sky. That same staggering, hunched movement. She turns back. Don't go alone. I race into the house and breathlessly show the map to my brother and father. To the sheriff. No words, we all tear through the woods. Branches breaking, flashlights dying, running, and I can't breathe. And don't let him be torn apart, and I can't breathe. And don't let him be, and don't let him be, and don't, and please, and no, and oh God, oh my God, there he is. Wolves. It wasn't wolves. Bullet through his chest. I didn't realize I had run ahead, and my father and brother and the sheriff are still running, and it's just me, and it's only me. and I'm holding him, and everything is so cold, and the ground is red, and lung punctured. He didn't. When the doctor comes, he tells me James didn't die right away. Catching rabbits, hunting deer, guns. Peter is crying in our living room. It was a mistake, he sobs. All the other boys had left. The gun went off, it was a mistake, and it hit him through the chest, and he said get help, but I knew he didn't have much time, and I didn't want to go to jail, but he said please help me, and I didn't know what to do. And he was already cold, getting colder, and the ground was so red, and I didn't know what to do. And I left him there. Baseball practice. Peter left and went to baseball practice. He was in shock, and he left James there to die, to soak the ground blood red, and he picked up the baseball bat, and he left him there, and he ran the bases, and he left him there, and he hit the ball, and he left him there, and he left him there, and he left him there. I leave Peter there, in the living room. My hands are shaking, and I can't be in that room. I can't. I don't know what I'd do to Peter, but I can't be in that room, and everything is red, and everything is cold. My brother, 13, my brother, gone. Something shifts in the trees next to me, and just like that, I'm back in the present, back in this strange, fading daylight, 30 years of time crashing back onto me like brackish waves. Nothing happened to Peter. Peter grew up, and Peter found himself a wife, and Peter had himself some children, and Peter found a job, and Peter bought a house, and Peter grew up. Peter gets to grow up. James doesn't. I get to grow up. I find myself a wife. I have myself some children. I find a job. I find a house. I grow up. I grow up, and James is in the ground. I move away. I can't stand to be near those woods. I grow up, and I stop believing in people that can find things they've never seen by closing their eyes and drawing a map. But I think about that woman, and I think about James, and I think about Peter, and it brings me here, back to these woods, back to this place, as the strange daylight dies through the trees. Wolves got him, I thought. Wolves got James. Before I knew about what Peter had done, I thought wolves got him. I wasn't entirely wrong.